The war in Afghanistan is now the longest in America's history, with no end in sight. Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould have filed broadcast TV reports from Afghanistan dating back to 1981 and have written 2 books on this subject. This edition of Independent Voices takes a look at their latest, Crossing Zero, to see if they can help us make sense of the war, the region, and our chances of victory. Stay tuned. I'm David Frankel, and this is Independent Voices. So welcome to Independent Voices. I'm your host, David Frankel, and our guests today are Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, authors of their latest book, Crossing Zero, which I happen to have a copy neatly here. And you can see here on the screen behind them the last book that they wrote, Afghanistan, The Untold Story. We actually, at WinCam in Winchester, ran a program on this several years ago, actually, when it was
two
done.
years ago.
Yeah. I've got this program titled, Can We Win? And so let me ask you, can we win? And I guess that involves defining how we would even know what victory looks like. Paul?
Exactly, David. The big issue with this whole situation all along has been what exactly is the objective of occupying Afghanistan? What is the objective of the troop surge? And this has been something that has been something of a moving target. It was sort of similar to what Iraq was. What exactly was the purpose of the whole enterprise? So the Obama administration, it was expected that when the Obama administration there'd be some clarity over what the policy was, there'd be a much more stated objectives in terms of what the U.S. was doing there and when the United States was going to be able to disengage. Instead, it's become a far more complex issue over the last 2 years. And instead of changing the policy, the Obama administration has actually accelerated many of the Bush policies that were there. And as a result, a lot of the confusion that surrounds it. We just did a book tour out on the West Coast, and we talked to a lot of State Department military people. And we heard a lot of frustration, a lot of stories of frustration from the front, from people who are actually on the ground, wondering exactly what Washington's policy is. There's a lot of interagency competition. There's a lot of confusion between what the actual job description is of what these people are supposed to be doing.
It's pretty scary after 10 years.
They are. It's very. It's debilitating, and that's been a big part of the problem. The people who are in the field, our soldiers that are in the field, our military people, as well as our diplomats, are really not getting clear directions from Washington over where this is all heading. And of course, needless to say, all the people that we're interacting with, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Russians, who all have an interest in what happens in Afghanistan, they're all saying the same thing. They're looking at the United States and they're saying, well, you've defaulted in terms of your leadership, so, what's next?
Well, to that end, let me just switch this graphic, if the graphic will work.
Here we are.
We've got several maps here to help really describe the complexity of just the geography and the ethnicity and politics of the region. And I know myself, I don't retain that many names in my head at once, let alone the history that got us to this point. So maybe could you describe a little bit what this is showing? And I noticed that the before and after possibility here in terms of a proposed solution by somebody that I'm sure you'll describe is that Pakistan gets to shrink. And I imagine that Pakistan's not excited at that possibility. But why don't you talk us through, first of all, who are all the neighbours to Afghanistan? Because I know what I've read about American geography tests is that Americans don't do particularly well identifying their adjoining states and cities in their own country. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure the vast majority, including me here, don't really fully assimilate all of these countries around there. So go right ahead, Paul.
Well, of course, the name of our book is Crossing Zero. Crossing Zero is the military intelligence name for the Durand Line. The Durand Line is this line that runs here, right down the middle of the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. In fact, it is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
And who drew that line?
That line was drawn originally in 1893 by Sir Henry Mortimer Durand for the purposes of administrating the Indian Empire. There was a great debate inside British Parliament in the 19th century over where exactly the northwestern border of the empire was. This is India down here. Of course, what is Pakistan today was India during that time period, but the British India. And the liberals believed that the Indus River was the natural border. The Indus River is around here someplace. And there are other maps we're going to show that show that. And the forward policy people, the conservatives, the Tories, believe that they should go over the Hindu Kush into Afghanistan, carve Afghanistan up into various ethnicities. And that's been floated again today. That same attitude has been floated by some of our foreign policy experts. Richard Holbrooke is an example, I think was probably an advocate of repartitioning Afghanistan. Afghanistan has already been partitioned. But what that partition originally did in 1893, as you see, the Arabian Sea is down here. This is the port of Gwadar. It cut Kabul. It took some of the richest provinces away from Kabul's administration and cut them off from the sea, landlocked them there, and gave this access completely to the British Empire. So the British Empire were completely able to control and contain whatever was going on inside Afghanistan, much to the dismay and to the disadvantage of Afghanistan.
What did the other people bordering Afghanistan feel about that? I noticed China is proximate but not directly. Well, I guess China really had a border with India, obviously.
Well, I think China was actually a part of the border agreements that were made in the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century.
And how do you pronounce it? Tajikistan and
Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. These were all areas. There's a great map, Louis Dupree's map, okay, where he gives you all the dates of the various provinces when the Russians moved down from the north in the 19th century, province by province by province towards Afghanistan, and the British moved up from the southeast.
So this was still pre-communist Russia, the Russian Empire.
This was pre-communist Russia.
Was growing.
That's right.
And absorbing these.
So this was pretty much
states.
settled. These borders were more or less settled upon by 1907. Okay, and then of course what happens is that that's pretty much the borders as they exist today. Iran's border was drawn up. What happened during World War II, of course, was that Iran was occupied, yes, half by the British and half by the Russians. And an ultimatum was given to the Afghans. Germany was Afghanistan's largest trading partner throughout the 1930s. And Afghanistan was essentially given a notice that either you evict the Germans or we'll occupy your country as well. Right. So they returned to an enforced neutrality during that time period.
So why was, maybe you could explain why was Afghanistan important to so many different interest groups here?
Well, Afghanistan really is in a prime location. I mean, it was the Silk Road in ancient times. This is the whole trade route. And in fact, there is the British attitude towards the region, which was really provided by Halford Mackinder, who actually had devised the concept of the geopolitical strategy known as Eurasia, being this region that had to be controlled by any power that really wanted to effectively be the real supreme ruler of the world, of whatever that power was. So it was critical for the British to basically to control Afghanistan, and that is really the hub of the control of the region. And this is one of the reasons why today, when they talk about Afghanistan, what's the value of Afghanistan? Well, when you're thinking of all those pipelines that are coming from all those places, and this is actually the most central location for all of those things to happen. So these are part of the reason. But there's an ancient history.
It's a crucial part of the energy strategy.
Absolutely.
For
of course,
taking product to market.
You've got oil and gas fields in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. You've got pipeline designs that are coming down through here into India. India is becoming a major industrial producer. China is a major industrial producer for the 21st century. So you've got also access routes from the port of Gwadar to these various places. There's an enormous copper mine being mined by the Chinese in ANAC, I believe the name of the
And I understand that
ANAC
the
copper
Iranians
mine.
would like to build a pipeline across there to
Pakistan.
to Pakistan,
Right.
and through to India, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
But the United States.
Well, the United
doesn't
States, this
want
is
them to.
part of the problem, is that the United States has its own geopolitical interests that go back basically back to the British, back to the 19th century.
And the geopolitical strategy of Mackinder, you know, of the idea of having to control the region in order to make sure that Russia,
Right.
and this certainly goes back to the 19th century, where the whole idea was to stop Russia from moving south into the region by the British Empire, and then the United States basically picking up the exact same agenda from the British Empire as it left the region in 1947 with the creation of Pakistan. So that's where you ended up with this configuration called Pakistan. That didn't exist until 1947.
Right.
So this became a very critical moment for Afghanistan, because the United States then began to engage Pakistan as its regional partner. And when you factor in the Cold War, then you begin to realize that the Cold War partner became the power base for the region. And because Afghanistan was really not viewed in terms of the United States as a strategic partner, it was kind of, sort of almost pushed towards the Soviet Union, which actually was not the choice of the Afghans. It was really what happened because of this kind of approach to the region by the U.S. And that went on, for 47 into the 50s. It didn't really begin to change until the 60s, when the idea that the Soviets were actually making headway into the region through Afghanistan, gets the attention of the United States. They begin to compete, in a positive sense, in the sense of helping develop the country.
There was a peaceful competition between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the 1950s, 1960s, until 1973. In 1973, there was a coup where the king's cousin overthrew the king, Mohammed Daoud. And that became an era. He was considered to be very close. They referred to him as the Red Prince. And he was very close to the Soviet Union. He appeared to be close to the Soviet Union as far as the Americans were concerned.
And
in reality,
presided
he
over
was a nationalist.
these relatively independent tribal regions, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can we take a station break there for a sec?
Sure.
Welcome back to Independent Voices. I've got here our guests, Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. Tell us a bit more about, this is Ralph Peters in the Armed Forces Journal, speculating about what would be an ideal outcome, new borders for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and this new state, Free Baluchistan, is that how you pronounce it?
Yep. Well,
Can you sort of elaborate a bit?
this guy, this is a 2006 map that he came up with. He redrew the entire region based on essentially ethnicities and history. So what he does is he gives back areas of Pakistan that were taken from Afghanistan in the 19th century, but he also gives Herat and the western part of Afghanistan back to Iran. So you're going back a few hundred years in terms of the various empires that control this region. The fact is that a lot of these areas, they share the same languages, they share the same ethnicities. They're not Arabian countries. Of course, this is South Central Asia. These are people who are Persian. They speak Persian. So they have a lot of the same cultural
So that's
milieu.
the logic he used. It was like
Yes, it was. It was a very
languages,
compatible languages, compatible
ethnicity.
borders, things that actually work for the people that live there. And in a lot of ways, it makes a lot of sense, except if, I suppose, if you're a Pakistani general or brigadier who wants to continue to advance the forward policy as the British did in the 19th century. What's interesting about Pakistan is that here, there is this big cry, hue and cry by these Pakistani leaders and generals particularly, over the invasion of their sovereignty, when Pakistan has had no problem invading the sovereignty of Afghanistan for the last 60 years. So this is
different.
Yeah. Here's a much larger country, who's got a much larger military and an American-trained military, and has been a U.S. ally, frontline state against the Soviet Union, have been violating Afghanistan's security and sovereignty for a long time.
I think there's a story, actually, that would be probably very interesting to tell. Pakistan basically made it impossible for Afghanistan to get its goods to port. And there were many times, once the United States engaged Pakistan as its partner in the region, Pakistan used sometimes that opportunity to basically affect Afghanistan's economy. Nobody could stop them from doing it, so they had no way to get. It's
kind of an act of war.
It is, and they ended up actually at one point having to go to the Soviet Union, who then became their partner in getting their goods out. But again, and in terms of the whole issue of Afghanistan wanting to be able to be an independent country to work with whoever they wanted, they really were forced into a situation where they had to be considered part of the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and that's what put them in jeopardy, really, instead of being left as a neutral state, which is what the British really used them as a buffered state, so that they were considered, a separation between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. So that gave them some neutrality and some kind of internal freedom, at least. But this created a real nightmare for them, because when the Soviet Union was drawn into Afghanistan in order to play out Russia's Vietnam, and Afghanistan became the place, then it became the playground for the superpower confrontation. And there was obviously a lot of pre-existing Pakistani bias. That goes back to the 40s, when Pakistan was viewed as the partner. So this is all part of the imbalance that is played out against Afghanistan's interests.
Who else would like this solution on the right? I assume that the people of Free Baluchistan.
The people of Free Baluchistan would certainly like that solution. I think there's a lot of people in Afghanistan who would like that solution. I'm not so sure about this whole business about Herat going back to Iran, but there's definitely something that's going to have to come out of this current situation. There's just so much inequality and so many things that have been left undone.
It looks like Iran loses something too, if I compare those two maps.
I believe,
there's a little chunk of Baluchistan.
I think there's a little chunk of Baluchistan. Yeah, there's a little trade-off at the bottom. But
Iran gets back quite a bit.
Iran expands quite a bit, yeah. And once again, the important thing is the empowerment of the local populations. And that's what these people do not have right now. These borders, these boundaries were drawn up in the 19th century by agreements between the Russians, the Chinese, and the British. And as a result of that, a lot of these things, these problems have festered over the century.
They ignored ethnic coherence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's one of the reasons in particular that this issue with Pakistan is such a problem, because it's the Punjabis who basically historically have been at war with the Baluchs and the Sinds. And so when this
and the Pashtuns.
And the Pashtuns too. And when this configuration was created, where people who were at war historically with the Punjabis now were being ruled by them, this created, needless to say, an endless crisis.
And Hamid Karzai is Punjabi?
No, Hamid Karzai is a Pashtun.
Pashtun, that's right.
He's a Pashtun.
So
from Helmand province.
Yeah, right. So where does that fit in here on the map?
Well,
is that part of Free Baluchistan?
Helmand is down in this area here. And I think we have other maps actually that show,
let's progress to this map.
Punjab is right here.
This helps to talk about the ethnic mix here.
That's the upper part.
Can you sort of just describe each color region there? And
well, this is the Punjab. This is the distribution of the Pashtun tribes in this area here in the green. The Baluchs are in the pink, and the Sindhis are in the yellow. And you can see Iran is over here to the left. To the west.
So now,
And Herat is, you see, Herat is right up here, but it's on this map, Herat is where it is today, inside the borders of Afghanistan.
so that Duran line, the zero, line 0, cut through whose
Well,
territory?
this is the Durand line right here, this line right here. It cuts right through the middle, as you can see, of the Pashtun areas.
So it splits the Pashtun,
Right.
It splits the Pashtun areas in two.
and it splits.
Now, you see the original line, there's Kabul up here. The original border of Afghanistan under the Durrani Empire was the Indus River. And now you see how much of Pakistan used to be Afghanistan. This entire section, from the border here all the way over to the Indus River here. So this was, up until the late 19th century, all of Afghanistan, all of this fertile territory here in the Indus Valley. So, these are, once again, these are issues that have festered with these various populations for since the 19th century over this issue. And of course, the creation of the state of Pakistan, ruled over by the Punjabis, certainly has exacerbated existing problems that were there during the 19th century and the early 20th century with the British.
When did they, I gather from discussions with you that there was a period of stability prior to the Soviet invasion. What did that look like in terms of borders and ethnic regions and so forth?
Well, in Afghanistan, I mean, basically, Afghanistan still had the border of the Durand line, basically, being Pakistan, but in terms of the stability, it was considered, I guess, from maybe the 60s into the 70s, 50s into the 60s and 70s. You basically had a reign of stability and education where King Zahir Shah, who was actually he came in the 30s, but he was very young when he came in, and he eventually, when he began to put in for much more progressive ideas. I mean, ideas that included education for women, and and they also had, I think, a lot of their own food production. In fact, in that period of time, they had been able to produce enough to take care of the country of Afghanistan. So you can see that even though they were completely isolated and very limited in their economic development, which was one of the crises that both the 19th century and the British Empire and into the 20th century had affected the economic development. So a lot of the progressive efforts on the part of a lot of the monarchies going back to the early 19th century really came up against a lack of economic development. And that had more to do with the inability to progress than it had to do with the idea that, I mean, for instance, women were given the right to vote in the 1920s, and other kinds of progressive acts that happened in Afghanistan, which were an indication, obviously, that they wanted to progress into the modern world. And this idea today, though, that Afghanistan was always like it was under the Taliban is simply completely, does not match at all the historical evidence. That it had really wanted to be a modern country, and women, rights and education for women, which I guess is considered one of the, the key indicators of progress, was at a very high level. And so I think there was something like, I think 20,000, was it 20,000 students?
No.
In the 20s.
Pardon?
It was around the same time, I believe.
Right, but the Afghan women did not have to ask for the right to vote. That is a difference. They were given it.
Yeah, that's
so
interesting,
that
yeah.
is a very, and
Wow.
I like to also remind people that Swiss women didn't get the right to vote until I think 1973 or something like
Yeah,
that, in the
that was very
1970s.
late. It was very
So
late.
the idea that somehow this is unique to Muslim countries, I think certainly is well worth pointing out. That's not the case. And Afghanistan was unusual in the fact, obviously, that it really wanted to progress women's rights very early on of its own accord.
Well, that's been one of the big problems with identifying exactly what's going on in Afghanistan. Is this broad brush approach that is taken by the media, as an example, and by certain officialdom, certain institutions, simply broad brush it as a Muslim issue or as a tribal issue or as a whatever issue, okay? When in fact you've got a lot of variations, cultural variations that need to be dealt with, that need to be specifically addressed, especially in this area. Afghan Islam was extremely different from Arab Islam. In fact, we had an Afghan recently tell us that the Afghans fought the Arabs for 500 years to keep them out of Afghanistan. So these are the kinds of nuances and sensitivities that are simply not expressed in the policy basis.
No.
So,
Yeah, we'll talk more about Richard Holbrooke and policy a little later on. I wanted to work through these maps because I think they help. Did I just skip a map there? No, that was the map we had. Here we go.
right.
Tell us a bit about this map. What does that tell us?
Well, this is just another version, a clear line. This is the Durand line that separates Afghanistan from Pakistan. Here's the Indus River here. You can see all of this territory from the border here all the way over to the Indus River was at one point in the 19th century the Durrani Empire. That was Afghanistan. And
Talk to me a little bit about the tension between India and Pakistan, because I understand most of the money we give Pakistan allegedly to, ostensibly to root out terrorists, actually goes to arming themselves to the teeth to fight India, rather than fund the fight against terrorism, and that always bothered me, a misdirection. But it just amazes me still that when you consider they play cricket against each other regularly, and there doesn't seem to be a good reason other than perhaps Kashmir for why they would be constantly in a state of potential war, escalatable to a nuclear war. Why is that?
Well, it seems that Pakistan really has a problem not only with Afghanistan but with India, which I think does, give you one sense of the fact that, again, they created in 1947, immediately embraced by the United States as its Cold War partner. Okay, it seemed as if it set in motion.
Because India was somewhat aligned with the Soviet Union. They were getting technology
right,
from them.
Yes, that was definitely the attitude. And of course, Afghanistan was sort of pushed off to the Soviet Union. So Pakistan really, there's a level of the development of Pakistan as a nation that really never took place. They went from being basically a part of India to suddenly, and actually it was mostly Afghanistan. 3/5 of Pakistan was once Afghanistan, and the rest of it was Indian. But this idea that they created a kind of state that wanted to get its way all the time, it seemed. Now, of course, there are serious issues too about the whole struggle to create Pakistan. Clearly was an issue of Hinduism versus Islam. So that became a critical delineation too between the struggle, and apparently, many millions of people were slaughtered in this division of India into Pakistan. So you have a tremendous, and again, the ethnic issues that were never resolved, and of course the Kashmir issue, which is this festering issue.
Line, yeah.
And I think that, the Kashmir issue really is the cornerstone of Pakistan's rationalization of its attitude towards India. Because of that crisis, they feel justified. And of course, the Indians have their viewpoint of, what is the...
I would have no clue as to the legitimacy of either claim, but it does seem that it perpetuates the need for an active, well-funded military. So is it a convenient excuse to keep the game going for them? Or is there a legitimate
I suppose you could say the same thing about India too. Instead of somehow resolving this to, that both countries really at some level, get to, sort of play that card, as it were. And the Indians are definitely, I think at this point, being outfitted as the America's newest partner really in the region, in terms of the amount of material, the military, purchases that are going on.
Well, the United States would like to outfit it. I believe India just decided not to go with the American fighters, fighter planes. They're going with the European fighters. European designs.
That's certainly in
so that was kind of a blow to American prestige in that particular instance.
Yeah, but it's still the militarizing of the region. That's the problem, though. And it certainly, it matters to American military industry that they went with the Europeans, but the issue I'm focusing on really is about the militarizing of the region, which is already so heavily militarized. So that's adding to the crisis that, seems to be dominated, though, by Pakistan's, constant, need to, everything Pakistan has done vis-a-vis Afghanistan, the excuse has been with its future war with India. So the creation of the Taliban, trying to take over Afghanistan and install a Pakistani-friendly government, all of those are rationalized basically based on because of the problem with India. So it does seem to be very key to Pakistan's justification for the way it exists.
The other thing that always gets my attention is the fact that India does seem to have a reasonably vibrant democracy that where the military is subordinate to the civilian government. Is that an illusion, or is that in fact a correct?
No, that's in fact true.
And so
India
why is
has
that happening in Pakistan? What?
Well, there's been a lot of reasons for that. I would probably put the blame largely on the Cold War.
Yeah.
The Cold War made Pakistan a frontline state, and
It never developed
there was a lot of
political
British interest at the time.
foundation.
As the British evacuated the area in 1947, they did it hastily, but they also wanted to leave a bulwark against communism and a bulwark against the Soviet Union during that time period, and proceeded.
So they empowered the military.
They empowered the military.
Funded them, trained them.
Exactly,
all those
and
sort of things.
unfortunately, a lot of the things that are, in terms of the architecture of the way in which Pakistan is run, is really a very archaic architecture. It's a leftover from the East India Company. Where an agent is designated to control the tribal areas, the
In fact, I found
various
that very
tribal
interesting in your
agencies.
book, Crossing Zero, as you went. I certainly recommend it as a read, by the way, because it's got a very good potted history that goes all the way back to the formation of the East Indian Company,
Right.
and why that happened. Do you want to give us just a couple of minutes on those roots? Because I think that certainly was very interesting to me.
Well, it's interesting when you go back to the origins of these problems that we have today. You see that in many cases these problems were created by, in this particular case, Britain. Britain was in competition in the 16th century and 17th century with Spain, and with a lot of other trading countries. As an example, Portugal and the Dutch also had trading companies. Were seafaring nations, and very successful seafaring nations. And Britain was not the Britain in the 1700s and the 1600s that it is today, needless to say, or that it was during the Empire. And they were looking for a way to finance their country and their expansion. So one of these things to do, they looked to the west, because that's where the Spanish were getting their gold from the South American, from Mexico, from South America, and bringing it back to finance their empire. And so the British tried doing that in North America. They brought back a ship at one point. I cited it that crashed off the coast of Ireland, and the Irish scathingly named it Fort del Oro, the Fort of Gold. And it wasn't gold at all. It was iron pyrites. And this is what they were. There was ships full of this stuff, and it cost them a fortune to go off and explore this. And they brought this back, and so it was a big scandal at the time. And so what happened was that instead of looking towards the west and competing with the Spanish, they looked towards the east. So in the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company personally to go off to India and begin trade to compete with the Portuguese and the Dutch. And that was the beginning of the East India Company. And year by year, decade by decade, the company kind of worked its way into the interior of the subcontinent, and until, of course, in the 1830s, 1840s, they came up against the borders of Afghanistan and the Pashtun tribes, and this is the beginning of those problems that Britain faced in terms of its colonial control.
What was the East India Company like? Was it a nice, friendly, benign?
Oh yeah,
kind of like your favorite supermarket proprietor?
It was kind of a combination of let's see, it was Bank of America and Blackwater.
Oh, nice.
Okay, they were very, very capable.
Your money or your life.
Your money or your life is a very good way to put it. They were very good at terms of extracting wealth from the various ways and from the various provinces that they took over. In some cases, they took over by force. In some cases, they took over by bribe. In some cases, they took over simply because of a lapse. There was no one to run the particular province, so the East India Company went in and said, "We'll run it for you." And so this went on and on for a long period of time.
Outsourcing is not as new as we
Outsourcing?
thought.
No. In fact, they probably. What's interesting is that in the process of doing the research for the book, we discovered that the East India Company flag was very similar to the flag of the United States. The original colonies, actually, George Washington's flag that he hoisted over his headquarters in Cambridge and in Somerville, that little fort that you see up in Somerville, Prospect Hill, was the East India Company flag. It was 13 stars and 13 stripes, but instead of the stars in the upper left-hand quadrant was the Union Jack. So nobody's really ever explained why. It had something, of course, the tea was what the tea in Boston Harbor that was dumped into Boston Harbor was done, that was East India Company tea. So it's been suggested. It's been suggested that there was an effort. There was a real effort to try to calm the East India Company down and to try to send the signal that the American colonists were really quite friendly towards international trade and business. They just didn't like being taxed for it.
Well, what's interesting, too, though, is to realize that it was when the East India Company came up against the Afghans that they met their match. And that's when, the British Empire encountered, it's the greatest loss, the greatest military defeat that they had ever had. But what's even more interesting, though, is the fact that before that happened, which was inaugurated in 1839, Alexander Burns, who worked for the British East India Company, had recommended that they approach the Afghans as a partner, and that he recommended that it would be better to have a strong emir who could control the tribes, and that would be the buffer against the the Russian encroachment into the region, rather than breaking it up into various ethnic groups and weakening it.
That could be picked off
one at a time. And what's even more interesting was Burns's observation that the Afghans were incredibly friendly and hospitable. He apparently wrote a letter home to his mother in the early 1830s telling her that these people are kind-hearted and generous, and they hold no prejudice against a Christian or against the British. So these ideas that he is putting forth, the common sense, work with these people, and what happens in 1839, that's when they activate the first war against the Pashtuns, against the Afghans. And of course they lose phenomenally. It was a complete catastrophe.
Right, and ironically, of course, that's the same attitude that the Afghans had towards the United States when we went in there in 2001.
Exactly.
Was that we were going to bring good things to Afghanistan that they deserved for their efforts on America's behalf against the Soviet Union in the 1980s.
So let's.
When are we finally going to listen to the common sense?
Well, that's a very elusive thing to find, let alone listen to.
So this is a map of some of the tribal agencies: Baujur, Momand, Khyber, Orakzai, Kuram. This is what borders Afghanistan, and this is the Afghan side of the border.
So these are all tribal regions.
Right.
Is this where their little local government they hold their what is called yurgas?
Yes, yes.
And
this is the North Waziristan area that's always talked about in the the United States wants the Pakistani military to go in, and it's pretty much controlled by the Haqqani network. And these are things that are a major bone of contention between the United States and Pakistan. And Pakistan, right?
This is a good map to pause on. My takeaway from your book was that you were incredibly critical, and I'm sure with a lot of justification, of the United States policy and its insensitivity to this very complex matrix of ethnic regions, tribal regions. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me more about that? And we mentioned Richard Holbrooke earlier on. He was very much driving American foreign policy in the region, and I think you're also, and you're not alone in this, very critical of what he was doing. He was much eulogized upon his death as being this fantastic diplomat that was well on the way to curing all our ills in that area. But it doesn't sound like you would agree with that view.
I have, at the beginning you asked the question about, can we win, and then the real question is, what is a win? And I think Holbrooke really represents a good example of how something can sound like it's going to be the win, but when you really analyze it, you realize that the Afghan people and the Pakistani people are going to lose. And that, as far as we're concerned, is the only gauge for winning.
Yes.
In particular,
That's a
Holbrooke,
lose-lose.
Holbrooke absolutely was basically supporting the worst aspects of the constantly imbalanced relationship that the United States always had with Pakistan, literally stating that the U.S. should absolutely work to stabilize Pakistan, and we shouldn't even care about stabilizing Afghanistan. So he literally just threw Afghanistan away. It was, and that we shouldn't even focus on it. So and the idea of negotiating with the Taliban is a perfect setup for that imbalance to really be permanently, overlay on Afghanistan, because the Taliban actually was a creation of Pakistani intelligence. What's called the Afghan Taliban are still very much heavily influenced by Pakistani intelligence all these years since the...
Are they armed by them at all?
Absolutely. They're totally supported by them. They live, inside... when the U.S. went into Afghanistan in 2001, the Afghan Taliban moved over the border into Pakistan. That's where they were taken care of. That's where they came out of originally in the early 1990s to eventually take over Afghanistan. They are Afghan, but these are like almost mercenaries at this point, who were trained in Pakistan this would have been in the early 1990s when they originally went in and basically recruited young Afghan boys and men out of madrasas, which were the only places where some of these families could have their children educated and fed. So there was a lot of, you might say, imbalance, again, in who was really running the Afghan Taliban. I think Charles Kogan, who is the chief of the Directorate of Operations for South Central Asia from 1979 until 84, stated in the last 10 years, he was quoted as stating that the Taliban is a wholly owned subsidiary of Pakistani intelligence. I mean, that's how completely.
And that's what the United States has been trying. That's what Holbrooke was trying to negotiate into the government of Afghanistan.
It serves Pakistan.
So the United States is funding Pakistan, which is in turn funding the Taliban, who we are busily fighting.
Right.
So it seems like a repeat of our war with China, the two Chinas actually, where they were busily we were busily funding Chiang Kai-shek, who had a surrender rate of about 50% with fresh arms, straight into Mao Zedong's army, and we kept that cycle going with tens of billions of dollars worth of armors. So we're arming our own enemy.
Well, that's why,
and training them.
And training them. So, I mean, once again, it comes at, the United States could get away with things like Vietnam, a lot of bad policy decisions.
At least we weren't arming the North Vietnamese and training them.
That's true.
To the best of my knowledge.
Well, I think a similar situation was happening. I think a lot of the ARVN soldiers were simply defecting and just turning over and selling them off on the open market. But I think that you want to buy a helicopter. I mean, I've got one.
We have a special.
We have a special this week. We have a helicopter for you, Huey gunship. I think that's the kind of thing the United States could get away with doing that when the American economy in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was the dominant economy in the world, and the United States was the world leader in that way. And so I think that that no
longer true,
and that is no longer the case. Not only that, but you have all these nations now that have nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and so you're really dealing with a case in which the United States is one among many now. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who came up through the 1950s and 60s and were trained in this foreign policy apparatus are now, they're still applying, and Holbrooke was a very good example of that. They are still applying the same standards that were in vogue in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when they learned them. But the world doesn't react. So it's almost as if they keep pushing the same button over and over again, but they're not getting the results they're getting. And of course, it's a shame that the man had to die under these circumstances. But I can imagine the kind of stress and strain that he's going through. This is an immensely complex issue, and his regime for resolving it certainly was. He just simply was laboring in the vineyard hopelessly, I would say.
If you had to pick the top three most egregious mistakes that America continues to make, what are they?
Well, let's start with originally arming the Mujahideen to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan.
I think we have a.
When the Soviets were begging to be negotiated out.
I like this. I like this photo, just to remind all of us just how cozy we were with the Mujahideen. This is the Mujahideen having a nice, presumably, chat with Ronald Reagan.
As
they
you
were
know,
called holy warriors back then. Today they're called terrorists.
supporting the Mujahideen, as you know, in the 1980s was a cause célèbre for the new right and the Reagan agenda. And of course, having the Soviets in Afghanistan kept the military budgets flowing. It kept justifying just a very aggressive posture. It was a narrative that was very much created. What's interesting about that, particularly from our perspective, is that we were in there in 1981. We were the first Americans to get permission to go in and see what was going on and talk to the Afghans about what was going on. And we were told, point blank, by the Afghan Communist Party members, they didn't want the Russians there. They would much rather have a relationship with the United States, and that they could not figure out why the United States was funding these crazy people who were coming in over the mountains and
burning schools
for women and kidnapping villagers and blowing up power lines. Why are you doing this to us? You know, the United States isn't a colonial power. Britain was a colonial power.
Oh, that was the
Russia's
mistake.
Russia's. Well, there you go. The assumptions are deadly if you make the wrong ones.
Yes.
And so these were the assumptions that were made. Now, in 1981, we came back and we met up with Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project, and Roger said, you know, is there anything I can do to help you in your efforts to understand what's going on in Afghanistan?
What year was this again?
That was 1981. We met Roger.
Okay. Well, at some stage, speaking of 1981, we should cut in the video you made.
Right, because that's a good.
It's a nice time capsule.
Yes, it is a time capsule.
Of
that 10 minutes. It's just 8.5 minutes actually.
Yeah. So why don't we just take a quick break there, cross to that video, and then we'll be right back. It's very interesting, and it looks like a very young Dan Rather hosting that particular.
And a very
CBS
young
news.
Paul Fitzgerald.
And a very young Paul Fitzgerald, as a matter of fact, too.
Indeed.
We won't go there. So we'll be back in just a moment.
In Afghanistan, rebel attacks on Soviet and Soviet-led local military forces appear to have increased during the past several weeks. This, at least, is what various...
The footage from our 1981 trip did not conform to what CBS News wanted to hear. We were told by the CBS producer that the front office had thrashed around for a month trying to figure out how to make our story conform to the narrative. They finally settled on comparing what we saw to Soviet propaganda.
Shortly before these reports, the Soviet-supported Afghan government authorized an independent American film team to visit the country. CBS News correspondent Steve Young, recently returned from Moscow, put the American film together with Soviet propaganda film for this report.
The truth of the April Revolution. In this film, we show everything as it actually is.
This film, made by Soviets for Soviets, does not show the Afghan guerrillas resisting the Soviet-installed regime in their country. But the film did provide one of the few glimpses of life in Afghanistan cities since the Soviet invasion, until an American TV crew was allowed in, the first American journalists to be officially welcomed in 16 months.
It is not as active and as volatile as we expected it to be. Perhaps we hit it on 10 good days. Perhaps the reason why they granted us the permission to come when they did was the feeling that they had reached a level of security where they could allow an American team in.
The Afghanistan that Paul Fitzgerald and his crew saw last month was much the same view the Soviets have been showing their own people. In Kabul, the capital, people seem to be going about business as usual. Not a Russian face in sight.
What Dan Rather wanted to hear was the official narrative that he had helped to fashion a year earlier, that the Soviets were bent on controlling Persian Gulf oil and that the U.S. wasn't doing enough to stop them.
America seems to be asleep. It doesn't seem to realize that if Afghanistan goes and the Russians go over to the Gulf, that in a very short time it's going to be the turn of the United States as well.
What Dan Rather didn't show you in our report was Afghan President Barbara Karmal citing the conditions under which the Soviets would withdraw.
Any time that a reliable and a convincible guarantee is given on the part of the neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran, and the United States of America and China, that there would be no recurrence of any sign of aggression, provocation, and interference into the internal affairs of Afghanistan. The limited military contingents of the Soviet troops would return to their peaceful land. Otherwise, if these interferences, provocations, and aggressions, particularly from the Pakistani side, continue to exist, then the limited contingents of the Soviet troops will remain in the country.
This is ABC News Nightline.
It's more than 3 years since the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and installed its current...
Our return trip in 1983 was to follow up on Karmal's statement. Was this just more Soviet propaganda put out to weaken America's resolve in the fight against the Soviet Empire? Or was it true? And if so, what would it take for the Soviets to go home?
Neither side has gained much ground, and attempts at negotiation have gotten nowhere. In effect, a military and political stalemate. Under these circumstances, earlier this month, a television news team headed by American freelance journalist Paul Fitzgerald was granted permission to spend 10 days in Marxist-controlled Afghanistan. For part of that time, they were accompanied by one of America's leading experts on crisis negotiation, Professor Roger Fisher of Harvard University. Here now is their exclusive report narrated by Paul Fitzgerald.
Roger Fisher of the Harvard Negotiation Project had already been approached by the Soviets when we offered him the opportunity to go with us to Kabul. And the results were startling.
I was in Moscow in October, and a Soviet friend of mine spent several days trying to get a hold of me, and when he did, he then said, "How do we get out of Afghanistan?" And I said, "That's the last question I expected you to ask." He said, "By we, I mean Americans as well as Russians." I said, "It's a lot easier for us to get out than it is for you." And that was there. And then when Paul Fitzgerald shortly thereafter said, would I go with him on another film trip, I said, well, put me down for a visa if it comes along, and I'll see. And since then, I've met with Russians in Washington and talked a little about the problem. And then when the invitation came through, indicated we could talk with people, I said, why not? So we went over.
How is a negotiated settlement possible?
Well, no one can know what the Soviet Union is going to do. We can fight the war politically and militarily. The way to influence the Soviet Union is to come up and give them a choice, give them a chance to get out, give them a chance for a neutral, non-aligned Afghanistan, which is not an anti-Soviet government, not a pro-Soviet government, but one which will have no military bases from either side. The UN is working on that. They're going back to Geneva in June. I talked with yesterday in New York with both Pakistan and Afghan ambassadors and with UN officials. I think there's a fair chance. No one can be sure. And I don't think the Soviet Union themselves know exactly what they're going to do, but we ought to construct and see if we can develop an option that serves them up, a golden bridge, a way to get out without a military defeat. We leave a coalition government. Right now they're leaving, I think they're opening it up. I think that Mr. Karmal is being downplayed. They're making it possible. He would resign if necessary. I'm absolutely confident he would resign.
You're talking about the Prime Minister?
The President would resign.
President, yes.
President Karmal would resign if necessary to help get a coalition acceptable government, and that's the kind of thing we have to be working toward.
Needless to say, the Golden Bridge was never offered because Charlie Wilson's war was gaining political traction as a vindication for Vietnam and a justification for Reagan's World War II-sized arms buildup. Everybody climbed on board the effort to hurt the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, apparently without a care that once started, the war could never be turned off.
It was such a heroic effort. It was so black and white. It was so good guys against the bad guys. They rose up and vanquished the evil invader. This is going to go down as the finest chapter in history of the Central Intelligence Agency. There's no question about that. They just didn't make any mistakes.
The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Towers was the first outward sign that some very big mistakes had been made.
We didn't look ahead to the monster this was going to create after the war. We really created a monster in Afghanistan. We've created fundamentalist, heavily armed fundamentalist factions that could never have achieved the kind of military capability without our support.
The monster that Sig Harrison saw created in the 1980s grew far beyond the Afghan war and Charlie Wilson's desire for revenge.
Islamic fundamentalists from all over the world hooked into these groups, got trained with our help through these groups, and now they're doing a lot of things we don't like.
So what was Charlie Wilson thinking when he pushed the billion-dollar program to arm and train fundamentalist factions when the Soviets really wanted to get out, at least as early as 1982?
It was up that if we could get them something sophisticated to be able to at least destroy the Soviet tanks and to be able to defend themselves against the Soviet helicopter gunships, that they conceivably could drive the Soviets from their land. It was a great 10 years.
It was a great 10 years for Charlie Wilson, but a bad 30 years for the Afghan people and American journalism. Because hardly anyone realizes today that the biggest mistake of all had been the charade to simply ignore Soviet efforts to leave Afghanistan while claiming that Charlie Wilson's war was being waged to drive them out.
We're back. What an interesting video that really was. It makes me feel young again to see Dan Rather at that age, and it must make you feel a little bit of nostalgia for the early 80s.
There you go. Yeah. Well, you know, those are tough times. It was very hard doing what we did. You know.
Yeah. How long were you over there for?
Well, the original trip I think was about 2 weeks. But I mean, I think I probably lost. I wasn't all that heavy to begin with, and I think I probably shed 15 pounds. Just gearing up for it, just the mental, concentration that was necessary to pull that thing together, get over there, get the equipment, negotiate with CBS News. We go in. What's interesting is that we got all this equipment over there. We got about $150,000, $200,000 worth of video equipment.
In those days, that's what you had to work.
You had to
heavy
drag
stuff,
heavy
too.
decks. I mean, now you can put it in your pocket and walk through through customs. Back in those
flash
days,
ram.
and you had to and back in those days, you had to declare everything before you left. You had to get serial numbers from the cameras, from the decks, everything.
So how did you
Every piece of
finance this
equipment.
exercise?
So CBS News financed it. CBS News paid it.
We owned the rights to it. We went to
We
them for
negotiated a contract whereby we owned the rights to the material that we shot, but they had it for 30 days.
So what was your background, just quick aside, that CBS would pick you two guys to go do this? It's like fascinating.
We got the first visa, and we had been working on we were doing documentary work before the trip. But it was the visa, basically. We figured out how to get it and got it, and nobody else had been able to get in. The Western media, the Soviet invasion was December 27th, 1979, and within a month, all Western media was kicked out of the country. So there was a blackout. And
no coverage.
No coverage at all. There were sort of periodic little pieces coming out. But
Dan Rather crept over the border.
Yeah, that type of thing. Yeah.
For 15 minutes and got shot at and then came back over. And that was in the spring of 1980.
Right.
And that was his inaugural. He was in the process of taking over for Walter Cronkite, the anchor chair at CBS News, Evening News.
And in '81, when you went there, that must have been scary.
Actually, what was interesting is that actually inside the city, landing in Kabul, there were fortifications there. The Russians had their planes, their fighter planes, their fighter jets lined up. They were surface-to-air missile batteries all over the place at the airport. But in terms of the actual being in the city, it was actually quite calm. It was very calm. There were, you would see a tank with sandbags around it. No, there was no sense of imminent threat, and we were pretty heavily covered by security. I mean, everything was arranged ahead of time where we went, and this is what's so interesting about it is that, I had to defend exactly what I saw very carefully to indicate that I was not being controlled, or what I did see was controlled. under the circumstances. But what's interesting is that, you know, I had to fight with the Afghans to get access to various things that I wanted to see, to shoot the pictures of Soviet tanks or Soviet armored personnel carriers, to meet certain politicians, to meet people on the street, that sort of thing, to get around the city, to get to different parts of Afghanistan that were under siege at the time. And then came back to CBS News and had to defend what I saw as part of the experience, and the fact that, well, you know, you were being controlled. Well, yes, I was, but I had to, you know, so I had to fight on both ends of the stick. I had to fight the Afghans, and I had to fight CBS News.
What was the most dissonant thing you came across? You know, that you went there with probably one set of views, and you came back, I am sure, with a somewhat altered change of view. What was the biggest change in your perspective that hit you?
Well, I think the most obvious was the fact that Afghanistan's story didn't exist in the Western media. It was a story about superpower confrontation. And what we brought back was this story about a complex internal process going on inside Afghanistan that just didn't seem to be of any interest to anyone. And that was part of the story that we were bringing back, was the fact that there was some kind of an evolution going on in this, you know, in this population, and that there was a voice there that, you know, just wasn't being, it wasn't that, you know, and again, this has to do with this idea of the narrative that we just saw in the piece, where, you know, you were basically, the framing of the story was about the freedom fighters. Well, that did not represent the complexity of Afghan population at all. Okay, that this was basically these sort of warrior wild men that only knew how to fight. You know, there was a very complex social process going on in Afghanistan. It had a lot to do with women's rights, and that was made very clear. Very clear
that women got their rights given to them that early.
Right, but that was called, according to Barbara Karmal, who was the president at the time, he referred to that as progressive Islam. And I think there are a lot of Afghans that would agree, even those who were not necessarily communist Afghans would agree.
Right through the 1970s, 15% of the state of the country's legislature were female. So this was, you know,
not unusual.
Women were lawyers, women were doctors, women were part of the bureaucracy. They were part of the negotiating teams, and so this only continued through the Soviet era. And the Soviets basically came in and protected that kind of situation. But the narrative, of course, was at the time, when you asked, you know, what was different, the narrative was specifically, we were told after the Soviets invaded that the Soviets were coming in to get American oil from the Middle East, okay, that they were in direct competition.
All of a sudden America was in the Middle East? It was our oil?
Right.
And that's exactly how the Carter administration responded. So it was a jumping off point. What, of course, as you said, what we saw specifically, and the people that we talked to specifically stated, as Roger said, he said, you know, they approached him in the fall of 1982. All right, and said, how do we get out of Afghanistan? If you look at the documentation, which we of course did in our books, about the background, you can see full well that the Soviets didn't want to go into Afghanistan in the first place. There was no plan to take over the Persian Gulf, no plan to drive towards the oil fields. They were not using Afghanistan as a platform for that. They were working their way into the country bit by bit and had spent an enormous amount of money developing the country from the 1950s on, but that was very much not something that the Afghans necessarily wanted. The Afghans had come to the United States looking for that assistance repeatedly, again and again, from the 1940s on into the 1950s, until they finally just simply gave up in frustration because of the lack of diplomatic acuity on behalf of Washington. And when they finally did go to Moscow and they said, okay, we want to sign an agreement where you'll train our military and we'll receive your weapons, Washington was stunned. They said, well, why did they do that? Why? What's wrong with us? So, you know,
this is what happened a while there in India too. I don't think India was that thrilled about getting their technology from the Soviet Union. But they were left with little option.
Little choice.
This gentleman here, about which we've had
yes, Charles Wilson,
a wonderful movie made with who's the
Tom Hanks and Julia
Roberts, right?
Mike Nichols directed it. right?
Yeah,
Should have been
exactly.
Julia Child.
Afghan would have been tastier.
It would have been much,
Right,
yes,
right.
But
much more easy to digest too, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so talk a little about Charlie Wilson. His role. He's been, he seems to have been immortalized by
Yes.
Hollywood.
Oh,
But,
yes.
But what did he do, and was it helpful or not?
Helpful. Oh my goodness. Well, he was the point man for raising the money that actually eventually led to giving Stinger missiles to and the Mujahideen, and a lot, and the financing was going through President Zia of Pakistan, who was basically making sure that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar got most of the money. He apparently received about 65% of the billions and billions of dollars that went through Pakistan. Charlie Wilson was told by high-level Afghans working in the United States with the U.S. that if there's one person he should not give the money to, it's Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, that he is very bad for Afghanistan. Charlie Wilson did not listen to that request, and in fact, he claimed apparently he thought that was just ethnic infighting. Well, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar has been a constant threat to Afghanistan since 1973 is when he first began working with Pakistani intelligence, and then came back over the border to try to destabilize, starting with the Daoud government in 1973 throughout the 1970s. So you're looking at somebody who has been working with Pakistani intelligence. I think that for an American to think, this would be like somebody in the United States working with the Soviets against the United States. This is a person who's actually committing treason, effectively. So this is the man that Charlie Wilson made sure got the bulk of the money, and because that's who Zia wanted to give the money to. So, and he
where did
became,
this money go to? What do we know what he did with this money?
He became very wealthy and very independently wealthy, and apparently has
several $billion
tremendous amount of resources. And it wasn't just Gulbuddin. I mean, the amount of what we call, I guess they call them now Al Qaeda. Well, the actual base of Al Qaeda were all these Muslim fundamentalists who were invited to come from all the prisons in all the Muslim countries. So they were being emptied out and all sent to Pakistan to train, given high-tech training, access to weapons, access to drug running, access to obviously Swiss bank accounts, the whole 9 yards. So these were people, and they apparently figured out on their own how to continue to maintain that. So the United States doesn't have a lot of control necessarily over a lot of the activities that eventually led to today.
Stansfield Turner, in an interview years ago, stated that if 20% of the money and the weapons that the United States gave the Mujahideen actually got into the field to fight Russians, then that was probably a lot. So many billions went in there. So where did the billions go? What did they do with the billions? We're seeing now what the billions provided. Okay, they provided the bases, they provided the training, and they provided the international connections for these ragtag bands of criminals, essentially, to become an international corporate mafia of drug dealers and crime. So this is what we've been up against in the last 20 years, and it's a direct blowback from Charlie Wilson's war.
So we're essentially financing our own worst nightmare.
Yes, no question
absolutely.
about it. And now we really don't know what to do about it.
That would appear to be so. Let me just cut that out. We'll finish the graphic on Charlie Wilson. So we're getting to the end of a 1 hour program here, but I think we would be remiss to not hear your recommended solution to this mess. If you were emperor for at least a day, and you could wave the magic wand and produce an outcome that you think would be best for them and best for the United States, best for let's leave it at those two parties, because there's so many parties when you go around those borders that I'm sure somebody is going to be dissatisfied with this. But what would make you feel that this is the make sense solution? And if it was you instead of Barack Obama, you'd issue this directive. Right. What would it be?
Liz has got a copy
I think
of a proposal here.
First I'd like to say that there have been absolutely an amazing array of recommendations mentioned. The country, federalizing the country, breaking it up into various ethnicities, negotiating with the Taliban.
Bring back the king and have the Jirgas and the local...
all kinds of different things. But really, what really is missing from all of these processes really is a way to guarantee that the Afghan people actually have an engagement in the process. And that's why we're working...
And they don't at this stage?
No. In fact, one of the real tragedies was in 2001, when the Taliban was driven out of Afghanistan. The great opportunity existed then for the Afghan people to immediately be given, some sense of autonomy for choosing their own government. But instead, the Bush administration chose to disregard what the Afghans practice their government, a kind of government called a jirga, where they have a gathering, and it's a very formal, it's an ancient gathering of their elders come together, but who have been chosen out of a very respectful process. These are not people that just get into these positions through paying someone off. It's a very genuine process of respect and of earning the right to be the representative of the people. And so the Jirga in 2002 wanted to bring the king back for unity, for a number of reasons. They felt symbolically that he would be the best. 75% of the Jirga voted for the king's return, which means that went across ethnicities, because there's only about 30% of the population is Pashtun. So it is the largest ethnicity, but it's still only about 30% of the population. So that meant a lot of other people wanted the king to come back. And the Bush administration said, no, we don't want any monarchy back there. We're going to basically tell you, you have to have Hamid Karzai. So Hamid Karzai was...
he's the king's substitute.
He was the king's substitute.
And why was that?
Well,
the fact that he worked for
was very,
before,
maybe it was. He was very, apparently they had certain interests that Karzai obviously was considered, I guess, enough pro-American, that this was someone that they could work with. This is certainly...
He came from the oil and gas industry, didn't he?
Yep, Unocal apparently. But I think that in terms of the process of trying to recognize that the two elections that took place did not authenticate Karzai, and really was not accepted as a legitimate process. The Afghans are having a hard time accepting any kind of legitimacy, certainly during an occupation. That's a very difficult situation. So we're working with an organization of Afghans called the New World Strategy Coalition, who are recommending a new kind of tribal jirga be established. And what I'm calling new is what we've done is identified what has failed in the past with the Afghans' attempt to try to invigorate their own process through their own jirga process. And we have laid it out in this document called Restoring Afghanistan's Tribal Balance, an indigenous peace process for unifying a shattered nation. And what is recommended is that we help them create a jirga that is truly an all-Afghan jirga that is truly representative of individual Afghans, not power groups. Like you can't, you have to realize that warlords were re-empowered by the Bush administration. The warlords who were empowered by in the 1980s in the first place through the U.S. financing. Those warlords then began to run wild over Afghanistan to the point where when the Taliban actually came in the 1990s, the warlords were so out of control that the Afghan people actually were willing to accept the Taliban getting rid of them. Unfortunately, then the Taliban turned on the Afghan people and then began
These warlords, their economic model was the opium trade?
Criminal networks, absolutely, and also basically the rule of, it's like a feudal warlord. They basically run their own fiefdoms.
Right.
And it's by the use of force, by the barrel of a gun. There is no legitimate process of earning the respect of the people at all.
So this national yoga would, the belief is that would help develop a national consensual governmental process.
Right, and it would be organized initially outside of Afghanistan because of the occupation. And so we have actually come up with an idea that there is actually an idea of bringing the Afghan people to Ireland to start the process, a gathering in Ireland to really try to start rewriting the Afghan narrative. It's an attempt to also try and help people understand that the real crisis for the Afghan people is not rooted in Islam. It is rooted in a worldview that the United States got handed by the British Empire to the United States that still views this region with a colonial viewpoint. And it actually is a problem with all indigenous people. Any people who are being subjected to sort of a worldview that's coming from any kind of power is really being subjected to this. So it's really a recognition of an attempt to recognize that that these people are suffering in the same way, actually, that the Irish people suffered for 400 years, with their engagement with the British Empire. And they were white Christians. They were not, Muslims. So I think these are important ideas to try to bring out of this. And so that's part of the solution. And this is actually available on our website.
Okay, what's your website?
Invisiblehistory.com.
Invisiblehistory.com.
Right, and we have actually got a blog on the bottom.
We'll put that up on the screen.
There's a blog on that. We could actually, provide. We have copies of the white paper that was done that lays out the whole concept, the reason why it needs to happen, how it could help resolve the real dilemma of bringing a genuine opportunity back to the Afghan people to be able to reinvigorate their own nation again.
Now, you've been to Washington to discuss this sort of approach, have you not?
Yes, we have.
What kind of response did you get? And who did you talk to, and what was the reaction?
Well, we haven't been to Washington to talk about this specific idea, but we have talked about Afghanistan to the local representatives. Representative McGovern from Worcester, I believe, his constituency, very positive in terms of trying to help the Afghan people get there, and also very insistent that the troops be withdrawn. And he's been one of the most outspoken individuals. And there's I think the overwhelming majority of people at this point do not want to see a continued military engagement. It's pretty clear that that the situation is only making things worse.
Yeah, no, that's probably a good note to finish up on too. Is now that Osama bin Laden has been killed, and it seems like the call to pull all the troops out as fast as possible has grown a lot stronger.
Yeah.
Because there's sort of some sense of closure that the precipitating event that drove us in was at least supposed to be that. What's your feeling if Barack Obama in the next 12 months really did pull out 100% of the troops? What do you think the consequence would be? Is that a good thing to do? Is it a doable thing?
The problem comes down to negotiating the so-called Taliban into the government of Hamid Karzai. And that, from what we see, the front page of the Washington Post just today, is that the Obama administration is accelerating the efforts to try to do that.
And you think that's a mistake?
I think that's a big mistake, and a lot of people think it's a big mistake. A lot of military people think it's a big mistake. A lot of news reporters who have been there on the ground think it's a bad.
The Pakistani ISI think it's a great idea.
If the Pakistani ISI thinks it's a great idea, then it's a bad idea.
Then it's a bad idea for Afghanistan.
And I think people have to understand that the administration is making a huge mistake if it thinks it's going to relieve itself of the problems it has in Afghanistan by negotiating the Taliban into the government.
Because it's just perpetuating their puppet.
It will make it even worse because this is a breeding ground for civil war at this point. And as well as the United States is resting a lot of its hope on the Afghan National Army, which is largely at this point a Tajik and Uzbek army. It is not a Pashtun army. There's a very small percentage of the army that is made up of Pashtuns.
So how come? Because the Pashtuns don't want to fight?
No.
Or because... How
Well,
did
the Pashtuns don't... First of all, the Pashtuns have been divided. They have been blamed for what happened because of the Taliban, their association with the Taliban. Mm-hmm. And the United States has favored the Tajiks, and the Tajiks have done the Northern Alliance. This is Ahmad Shah Massoud's people. Now, the interesting thing is that right before Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated, prior to 9/11, he made a lot of statements in support of bringing the king back and reestablishing the kind of government that was there prior to the Marxist coup in 1978. And he was killed. So his leadership the Tajiks were missing his leadership. And so what's happened since then is that you've really got an ethnic conflict going on between the Tajiks and the Pashtuns. And the more the Tajiks push with their Afghan National Army supported by the United States against these Pashtun areas, the more the Pashtuns are inclined to align themselves with the Taliban. not out of love for the Taliban, but out of their discord with the Tajiks.
So if I could summarize, by supporting the idea of the Taliban as part of the government, we're essentially providing an agent of Pakistan with a major seat at the table.
Exactly.
Right. And
funded
we're
and controlled by
And not
them.
only that, there's another aspect of that as well, is that we have established a democratic form of government there. It's loosely democratic form of government. And the fact is that the Taliban, what the Taliban stand for and what Al-Qaeda stands for, is breaking down that form of government and replacing it with a caliphate.
There's another issue that
Or an
really-
emirate, actually.
that the Taliban, the United States is acting as if it's carrying the interests of the Afghan people by negotiating with the Taliban. Karzai himself does not have the respect of the Afghan people at this point, has not really earned the authority to even be the president of the country. So here you have the man that is supposedly the president who has not earned that yet. The Taliban are viewed by many Afghans as equal to Nazis. That's what we're told all the time. This was like Nazis invading Poland as far as the Afghans were. So you're basically telling people they have to live with their kidnappers, effectively. Yeah. Now I realize there are individual Afghans who turned Taliban. This is not saying that they cannot return and live in Afghanistan, but they shall not be given political power. This is what we're talking about. This is the real crisis.
Yes, it's not a consensual power.
No.
This would be effectively imposed by the United States with the blessing
of the Saudis as well.
Yes,
the Saudis are very
and
interested in replicating their form of government and their form of institutions in Afghanistan, and that is something that the Afghans, as I mentioned earlier, have been fighting for 500 years.
Exactly.
That is very interesting. Look, that brings us to the end of the program. I really want to thank you, Paul and Elizabeth, for joining us today and hopefully bringing some additional clarity to a very otherwise confusing situation that I take as confused governments and peoples for centuries. But I thank you very much. I certainly got a lot from that discussion, and certainly from your book. And I certainly recommend that you folks take a look at Crossing Zero. It's very insightful, a very good way to absorb the history and the current situation.
It's a quick read.
It's a quick read. It is a quick read. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
It's been great being here.
Been a pleasure.
Likewise.